Professor William Sharpe, most welcome to this interview.
Thank you very much.
We're very pleased to see you here. How did you react that morning, I think it would have been, when they called you and said that you had been awarded the Economy Prize in memory of Alfred Nobel?
Well, it was eventful. My wife and I were at a conference in Arizona, and the phone rang about 4 o'clock in the morning. And by coincidence, there had been some chap in Belgium, I believe, who was trying to get me to speak at a conference or something, and he'd been calling at very strange times. And so my first reaction when I first heard someone on the other end of the line was that it was this guy from Belgium. And then, I was immediately reassured. So I was pretty sure. And then, of course, your second thought is it's a hoax.
Yeah.
One of your friends or colleagues. And so I was 99% sure it was real. So after we finished the chat, we turned on CNN, and within about 5 minutes, the first announcement came across, and it had many inaccuracies in terms of there were 3 of us. But nonetheless, there was enough there that we were pretty sure that it was real. So needless to say, we were both elated. And so we ordered room service and sat on the balcony looking at the sun coming up and across the desert before everything broke loose and became crazy. But it was, and I had not even been paying attention to the fact that this was the date for the announcement. So it was very much a surprise, a very welcome one.
Mm-hmm. Any particular memory from the celebration in Stockholm that you would like to share with us?
Yes, we took an extended family, and my father was not well, but all of his doctors gathered together to find ways to get him there in good health, and he absolutely reveled in it. He marveled about everything. And as it turned out, there were 11 in our party ultimately, and it turned out all of us got colds and were sick to varying degrees, except my father,
Okay.
who went strong the entire time through and just had the time of his life, as did all of us. It was truly magical, and there's no other word for it.
In which way has it changed your life, if it has, professionally, privately, after the award?
Well, I think there's a period, and I'm talking to others, I think this happens a lot, in which you almost are unable to function because you feel that people expect so much, out of the next paper, that the standards are so much higher because of the prize that it's almost impossible to write a paper and feel it's good enough to submit for publication. So there's some of that. One gets over that. You certainly, especially in financial economics, where there is a tie to the real world and to the world of commerce, you tend to get invited to give ever so many lectures or talks or whatever you want to call them, and you have to have the good sense to limit that and to get back to work, if you will. So it's difficult. There's no danger of being lionized by your colleagues because your colleagues know exactly who you are. So that doesn't change at all. So I think it's basically trying to determine what balance you're going to strike between, among the things that you've always done. Some people feel that they have a bully pulpit and that they should use the position to go out and try to affect policy. Some, to some extent, commercialize it, or take commercial advantage, let me say, of the position. But I think the majority of prize winners try to keep doing pretty much what they've been doing, with probably more focus on things that are for the public good, perhaps, than they might have put otherwise. But
have you felt so that you had to kind of use this award in a way that would benefit more people?
Well, my research had been moving towards, my research has always had a substantial pragmatic aspect towards helping people make sensible investment decisions, trying to understand the determination of asset prices, and helping people then understand that and then make good decisions conditional on that. And I'd been focused heavily on institutional decision making by large pension funds, for example, because that was the major vehicle, public and private pension funds, that was a major vehicle for saving and investment and sort of lifetime consumption planning, if you will, up to the early 1990s. But then as the shift accelerated towards putting more onus on the individual to make saving and investment decisions for retirement, I wanted to turn my research in that direction because that was going to be a huge need to help individuals do it right.
Absolutely.
And sensibly. So that was the direction my research would have taken in any event. And it seemed to me then, it seems to me even more so now, that that's an area in which financial economics has to really help people.
In the Western world particularly, or right across the board, do you think? I mean,
well, certainly in the Western developed world and in the in the middle ground. I mean, in the Mexicos and Chiles of the world, in the countries that are really just beginning to develop, we're probably quite a ways from that. But you're certainly starting to see this as an issue in China, for example. Put them where you will in the process. So I think just increasingly, that's rightly or wrongly, the social programs are covering a certain level, but even the social programs in Sweden, for example, are now adding a substantial amount of decision making on the part of the individual.
Which has been very difficult for many individuals to accept, I think.
Yeah, I'm absolutely certain. And there's some very serious issues as to how much latitude you want to give people, at least for a minimalist level of protection. There's some very, very important social issues.
Do you think we are at some kind of turning point there? I mean, where the Western world and the governments in the Western world has to rethink?
Well, I think it needs to be thought through much more carefully. My belief is that the driving force is the demographic shift towards so many more older people per younger person, basically, in so many of our countries. And we need to figure out an appropriate way to share risk across those generations and, of course, within the generations as well. And I don't think we're anywhere near the point of having understood or thought through, especially at a political level, what the trade-offs are. So I think far more needs to be done to inform public policy. But there's a lot of fundamental financial economics work to be done as well.
Yeah.
In the meantime, we need to try to take what we think we understand about asset prices and bring it to bear on the decisions that individuals are making and are increasingly making, and help them one way or the other to make those decisions intelligently.
It's a fascinating field and so much still to be done. I would like to come back to that a little bit further down in our interview, but as a child, were you thinking that you would go into this field? I know that you like sailing, for example. I don't know whether that was later in your life, but as a child, were you interested in maths, for example?
No. Well, I mean, I if you go, say, through high school, I enjoyed the technical courses, chemistry and physics and mathematics to an extent. My mother wanted me to be a doctor.
Okay.
So I started out in college in a pre-medical program. Didn't like chemistry in college for whatever reason, and shifted to a business major, knowing really nothing about business majors or business for that matter. My parents had both been educators. And so the first course I took was the required beginning economics course. And until my sophomore year, I didn't know anything about economics. Economics was not in the high school curriculum in California in my day. And I loved this course. I loved.
Why?
I loved the beauty of it. I loved the logic of the theory. I loved the practical aspects of it, and I just really enjoyed it. And I thought, well, I don't really know what economists do. I suppose I'll work for a government or something, but I have to take more of this. So I switched to an economics major and never looked back.
I can understand that it must be fascinating. The other thing that you did was also to very early go into computers and learn about computer programming. Did you at that time foresee in which way we will be depending on computers, particularly in the financial field?
Absolutely not. No. Again, I think I went into computer programming partly out of necessity, but I was at a very exciting place, the Rand Corporation, where some of the most important early work on computer programming and computer software, if you will, and algorithms was being done. And I learned programming both to help me in my own research, so I could do my own research processing, but also it was sort of like the economics experience. I just loved the logic and the practicality of it, and the fact that, you know, it's very Pavlovian, and that you do something here and then you get an immediate response to the stimulus. It's, so you get rewarded very, very quickly if you do it right. And so how much of it, my interest in programming was pragmatic, and how much was just, you know, liking the logic and the practicality of it, I can't tell you, but I continue to program to this day, many, many hours. Again, it's very rewarding.
In the financial market, I mean, we can sit anywhere in the world and do huge transactions or small transactions. Does it scare you, or is it a useful tool in today's financial market?
I would say yes to both questions. It's frightening. On the other hand, it's extremely useful. And I mean, there's so much we can do to allocate risk efficiently across regions, across individuals, across institutions. But with that comes danger, and we have to learn how to use the tools. We have to build the institutions that can at least minimize, never probably avoid, the risks associated with people making honest mistakes and people doing dishonest things, because both happen. And they're very, very powerful incentives in the financial world to do, you know, to do things dishonestly, and so it's very dangerous. But it's such a force for good if used appropriately that I think we've just got to find a way to minimize the bad things and be able to enjoy the good aspects.
You said, I've just read that during your student days, everything must be questioned. It was one of the advice that you were given. Everything has to be questioned. Everything.
Yes, my mentor, yes.
Yeah. You should be, every theory that you're coming up with, you should be your own devil's advocate. Have you continued to have that, brought that with you in your daily life?
Yes, indeed. I mean, because of the jet lag, I was awake for several hours last night and working on some theory that I've turned my attention to, and I was doing exactly that. Let's see, I think I can make the following simplification, and then say, now, if I were the reviewer, if somebody had given that paper with that method, and I were the reviewer whose job was to find fault with it, what would I try to find that was wrong with the argument or wrong with the algorithm? I think that's absolutely essential. Question not only everybody else's work, but question your own work as you do it, let alone after it's done.
The model that you got the prize for, to speak, the capital asset pricing model, has been part of many students' textbook over the years. Today, how valid is it? And obviously it's used a lot, but do you see that it needs to be revised at times? How do you look at that theory that you then brought up, so to speak?
Well, that's a question that it's hard to answer in less than 200 pages.
Okay.
But let me take a crack at it. The original capital asset pricing model made a great many very simplifying assumptions, as theories do. But especially the first theory that tries to tackle a particular area, and in some ways it was. Again, others were working in similar areas. I'm not saying I was the only one. But it was really simple, really simple. And that's a great strength, but it's also a great weakness. In the period since the early 1960s, people have looked at a lot more elements of what happens in the real world when asset prices are determined. My most recent work has actually started from a different place, started from the Arrow-Debreu view of the world, which is different than the Markowitz view of the world, and tried to explore a lot of the aspects of, quote, reality in that setting. That exploration, if you look at the simpler cases that motivated the CAPM, produces the CAPM. In the more complex cases, it produces something that will be more nuanced and have more complexity. What continues to come through pretty strongly, sort of the fundamental economic insight that the risk that is rewarded with higher expected return is generally risk associated with doing badly in bad times. That's sort of the key insight, and that is preserved, not perfectly, but reasonably well in quite broad settings where you take into account many other aspects. People have jobs, people have houses, people differ in their predictions of the future, et cetera, et cetera. And so I've been working in that area. I have a book in draft form exploring some of that using simulation technology, actually. Computer programming. And, so yes, is the CAPM too simple? Yes. Can we do better? Yes. Have we done better? Yes. That is not to say that it's a simple matter to empirically differentiate among the possible candidates for a broader approach. But I don't tend to think of the alternatives as replacements for the CAPM, but more realistic models, building off the same basic idea of prices being determined by people coming to market and interacting with one another and doing trades and setting prices until equilibrium is determined.
I would think that the world has also changed. I mean, it's
yes.
a more
Yeah.
complex economic situation in the world today since the first model was presented, or the first draft of the model or the version.
Well, that's interesting. It raises an interesting point. There was a period in the late 1980s in which I was working with some models which took into account the stylized fact that it was probably difficult or costly or possibly impossible for people to take so-called short positions, to take negative positions in assets. And I've gotten some rather nice results. But I more or less, and I described some of that in my Nobel speech, but to some extent I've convinced myself that because of the modern developments in risk sharing with derivatives and exotic financial instruments, probably the world is closer to the simple CAPM in some ways than it was when I did the CAPM,
Okay.
because now it is possible to take different positions vis-a-vis risk using financial derivatives. where before it was very difficult for people who wanted to do that in certain circumstances to take short positions and engage and get their broker to loan them stock, et cetera, et cetera. So to some extent, I think that the increase in financial technology, broadly construed, has actually brought us closer to some of the, quote, perfect worlds in some of the simpler economic models, be they Arrow, DeBrew, or CAPM type.
You have yourself gone between the academic world and the so-called real world, working as a consultant, starting up your own firm. How important has that been for you to be able then to test and to verify and to learn as well, I presume, from the so-called real world?
Well, in financial economics, at least, I certainly won't speak for other fields, but in financial economics, I think that each side can inform and improve the other. I think that it's really helpful when you're doing academic research to know something about the instruments that are available and some of the transactions costs, if you will, and institutional impediments in the real world, and also some of the motivations, if you will, of the people who are players in the real world. So I think academic research can be informed. First of all, you can focus on important problems, and you have a better notion of what's important, and you can build more realistic models of the people who are interacting, creating the worlds that you're trying to understand. So I think the real world can considerably inform the academic research. And of course, I have to think that the academic research can be of huge value in the real world. I do think that, and that's been my experience, and I think the experience of many. I think, in fact, it's a bit of a conceit for financial economists, but I think we think, many of us, that we have had more impact on actual practice than a number of fields, both in economics and perhaps in other disciplines. I don't know about other disciplines. But, and certainly, I think then in many other fields in what's called business administration or business education, I think the impact of economists on the financial practice in the world has been really quite profound. And so I think whether you want to do academic work only or you want to do practical application only, spending time on both sides of the street is helpful. My personal circumstance is that what I really want to do is understand the world and help people, make better decisions in the world. So given that particular utility function, it was imperative that I spend time on both sides. And what I've been trying to do over the course of my career is get the balance right. Sometimes it's too much on one side, sometimes it's too much on the other side, and so it's a delicate balancing act.
What advice do you give to young students then who are looking into the field of research, people that you have met and that you are meeting maybe right now? Are there any particular fields that one should look into, given what you said earlier about the way that the individual today, particularly in the Western world, has to really think about one's own finances, and particularly in the pension schemes, for example?
Well, I think there are two issues. If you're advising a PhD student as to what to do, and the student wants to have an academic career, there are certain things which give you a better chance of going to a top university or research institution, and they tend to be more abstract, they tend to be more technical, they tend to be in areas that are particularly demanding, technically demanding, at least that's my experience. On the other hand, if you want to do something that's going to change the world in important ways, then you do want to look at the big problems that are both big and hard, and potentially problems that you can contribute to solving. You never
For
solve
example?
them. Well, again, my personal preference is, at the moment, is helping individuals or helping societies decide how to balance the demands of those who want to consume, be they old, retired people or young, working people, and those who have to produce. So how are we going to take the amount of production that we can get out of the society and distribute it among the people in the society? And that has, of course, a temporal aspect. As you know, the traditional way is that you work when you're young, and you consume less than you produce, and then when you're old, you consume more than you produce. And how are we going to work all that out, given huge uncertainties, in particular uncertainties on the mortality healthcare side, which are I mean, grave uncertainties for the individual, but even societally. And that, of course, has huge implications for distribution of production and consumption across the globe between the less developed world, where you're still getting population increases, and the developed world, where population, at least absent immigration, is either stagnant or actually going to be decreasing, apparently. So there are huge issues to be dealt with there. Cuts across many, many fields of economics and many fields that aren't economics. So that's an area that I find fascinating and is clearly important, and the area that I spend most of my time thinking about, but that doesn't mean everybody should.
That does lead me to the last question, really, and that it's been fascinating to listen to you and to and that is, if we just look at U.S. economy today, for example, with a huge budget deficit and obviously taken on, politically, a huge commitment outside America. I'm thinking about Iraq, for example. How volatile is the world economy when we have all these uncertain factors, and when you can see one of the largest economy in the world having such huge economical problem as we are now seeing in America?
Well, first let me give you a caveat. Macroeconomics and monetary economics, for that matter, international economics are not my fields. So my opinion is not a very informed opinion. I'll give it to you anyway. I'm very disturbed, obviously, with as is everyone, with what's going on, the things that you mentioned. I'm not at all convinced that our responses politically or economically have been the best responses to the situations that we've been in the last few years. And I'm speaking now of the United States. And in fact, I have fairly strong opinions to the contrary. But again, I don't want to say that those are deeply informed opinions from a professional standpoint. But I think the general issue of the increased uncertainty, one of the fascinating issues, and it's sort of a knee-jerk reaction when you ask the question, is to think about allocating that risk across the globe. If take a trivial example, let's say we know that there will be a level X of terrorist incidents across the globe, but we don't know where they'll be or perhaps what form they'll take. But the law of large numbers is such that we can predict with quite some accuracy, in some abstract way, the level. Then presumably we could set up various kinds of insurance or financial contracts across the globe to pool that risk, so that obviously the people who are directly and personally affected can't pool the risk of being injured or killed. But nonetheless, you can insure some of the economic effects. So it's possible that with good risk pooling procedures, and we're better at that now than we used to be for all the reasons we've spoken about, that we can ameliorate the impact of that on any given person, rather than having a situation where you're attacked and suffer badly and I'm not attacked and I'm fine. We can pool the risk, so we'll both suffer to some extent, but not differentially, other than the direct personal costs of attacks. So the idea of global terror insurance is something that comes naturally to mind to somebody thinking about risk sharing and risk pooling. that can help ameliorate the uncertainty and perhaps dampen the impact in terms of a global meltdown. But nonetheless, it's terribly concerning, even with the best risk sharing in the world. And of course, from a human standpoint, everything that's going on. And I'm worried. Obviously, you alluded to the issue of deficit financing. I'm worried about the intergenerational issues, which I think are not trivial at all and have not been thought through that well by politicians, and certainly have not been brought to the level in political discourse, at least in the United States, to allow anything like an informed decision. I despair of a politically informed decision, given the nature of our politics, at least, on much of anything. So I think there's much more that needs to be done, and it's a very frightening time, very frightening. And I think economics can help. Can't solve all the problems by any means, but I think it can help. Good economics.
Because when you see the huge disparity in the world, I mean, between the developed and the developing world, that's another huge concern, of course, which we could,
Absolutely.
I mean, what is feeding the terrorist attacks that we are seeing as well, and that's a huge political question, obviously, but I think as well an economical question.
Well, I mean, even if you take, the classic economic person argument, where everyone cares only about his or her welfare, narrowly construed, which is a terrible view to have to take. But even if you take that view, I think what you're suggesting, I believe, makes great sense. It undoubtedly is worthwhile for people in the highly developed countries to do more than they're doing now to redress some of the disparity between the highly developed and the highly undeveloped or far less developed countries. It's just a matter of pure self-interest. Now, of course, if you add to that some concern for other people, then you get an even stronger case. So I do not think, and I would say mea culpa, especially in the case of the United States, I don't think we're doing anywhere near enough and from a humanitarian developmental aspect, strictly from a self-interest standpoint. And of course, I would think we should do more than that, but that's my personal preferences showing.
Thank you so much, Professor. I really enjoyed speaking to you, and I'm looking forward to hear more during this.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.